News Radio 700 WLW.
Alongside Jason Williams again today. And Jason, the saga of the pandemic and COVID and all this continues. Obviously, last week, Joe Biden came out and said he's going to mandate vaccines for companies of 100-plus employees. That could affect anywhere between 80 and 100 million people around the country. So we have that. Lots of talk, of course, about the vaccine itself. But the other thing I'm sure you've heard a lot of chatter about is the booster shots and the need for the booster shots. The White House in particular you see it more and more of late, at least I do. The constant, little bit of a push towards, hey, if you want to get the boosters are coming. We're probably going to need it because the efficacy of the vaccine wears off and you got these new variants. So boosters. Well, at the same time, there was a review published in The Lancet, which is like a top medical journal, and it argues, all the doctors involved with that argue that there isn't enough data to warrant booster shots, and that the general population is already vaccinated, citing the vaccine's efficacy is still high enough to prevent severe disease and death. And I guess there's a bunch of authors of this article who basically have resigned over this controversy and the push by the White. So long story short, there is a lot of mixed messaging going on about boosters. So we want to get the bottom of this, and we'll turn to a guy who's very involved in the healthcare field. He has a book out on healthcare called The 60% Solution, Rethinking Healthcare. The one and only Todd Furniss. Todd, how are you?
I am terrific. Thank you so much for having me today.
So what is your take on this, Todd? On one hand, you have the White House saying we need these booster shots, and then you have medical professionals say you probably don't. If we're supposed to be following the science here, I'm confused.
Well, you are not alone in that regard, and many of us join you in being confused, which is not a good place to be. So let's just take this apart one by one. CDC comes out and says a booster may be a good idea, may be a good idea, if you're severely immunocompromised. And that translates into the administration saying everybody needs a booster. So that's about as big of a logical leap as you could make. So in addition to Lancet's article, Cleveland Clinic came out and said, hey, wait a minute, guys, experts don't agree on this idea at all, and we're not recommending you get the booster either. So where we seem to have a pretty strong divergence is from whatever the White House is saying about COVID and the need for boosters and mandates and all this other stuff, and the science that supports that conclusion, which apparently doesn't exist. And then you have the other boundary, which is the constitutionality of all this stuff. So I just don't understand why the administration is taking the approach it is. It's not anchored in anything that I can see that's rational.
Todd, is it as simple as saying that? And it's not. This is complex, yes, but can the answer be that this is where policy and politics clash and don't align with each other? Essentially, you got the politicians who want to do one thing and the experts who are saying the other thing, and you've got people arguing in back rooms, and this is what you get: confusion. Is it as simple breaking it down to that?
Well, I think there is a lot of political orientation here because the whole pandemic has been politicized, and we had just an abject failure of leadership throughout both administrations in my regard. The first error we made was by combining the role of research scientists in projecting what the risk profile looks like, and then also giving the research scientists the right and the obligation to dictate what the policies ought to be to address that risk. Well, any self-respecting scientist is going to say, I want zero risk. But that's not the world we live in.
Right.
And so what we've done is we've created this culture on the other side as a result of that, of a culture of fear. And that culture of fear tells everybody, hey, wait a minute, this is a really, really a bad problem. But I saw something on the web today that I thought was both analogous and amusing, although not intended to be diminishing at all of the magnitude of the issue. But it said, look, if you had a 99.7% of a bowel movement problem, would you wear diapers all the time? Meaning the 99.7% chance it would never happen. Would you wear diapers all the time? No. And the same issue is with COVID. There's a 99.7% chance of survival with this disease. And as importantly, the people who are most at risk are the people we're not talking about at all.
Yep.
78% of all people who've been intubated or hospitalized and died have been obese.
Yep.
So the problem is not COVID, the problem is obesity. So why aren't we talking about that as a nation? Why isn't the administration rolling out better food plans, and eradicating food deserts, and talking about clean water and better sanitation? Why aren't we making sure that Flint, Michigan never happens again? Why aren't we having that conversation?
Yeah, or if you're going to mandate anything, it would probably be, you wouldn't do this, but you'd mandate like exercise or a gym membership would have probably more of a positive effect than some of these other things. And you're right, that has been the main thing. Is there's been the goalposts have been moved so many times, and in a country and an administration where you think you'd want people at the end of the day to trust you. Right? If you want them to get on board with what you're saying, they got to trust you. And when it starts off with, hey, we're just trying to flatten the curve here, right? We can't defeat a virus. There's never a scenario where we're going to have 0% deaths on this thing. It's going to happen. We're a nation of 320 million people, but we got to squash the curve. We got to make sure the hospitals don't get overrun. Well, that, in the most part, didn't happen. Outside of New York, hospitals really never got overrun. So then it became, well, we're going to try to defeat death here, right? I really feel that that's kind of where it went to, is we're going to make sure there's no instance where any kid gets sick, any adult gets sick, anybody dies from this thing, and which is an impossibility. But by trying to reach an impossible goal, we have confused people beyond belief.
Well, and further to the point, I fear that we've actually done things which are incredibly counterproductive. So between 1996 and 2007, there was a policy decision by the good folks at NIH, wrongly founded, that said, and not based on science at all, that said you shouldn't expose your children to allergens. Okay, because they might get allergic to something. Well, guess what? Mm-hmm. They weren't exposed to allergens, and now they have allergy problems because as children they never developed the immune system response to the allergens themselves.
You see that?
So fast forward, what do we have today? 30 million people have food allergies.
Yeah.
And so 80 million people in the aggregate are affected adversely by food allergies. So because of that policy decision and the failure to develop immune responses properly, we have a problem that's going to happen that's going to last for at least a generation. Well, we have a similar problem here where we're not developing an immune response that's natural. So, for example, when they start saying, hey, we got to vaccinate kids under 12, hey, full stop, bad idea. Kids under 12 are very, very unlikely to have any symptoms at all, and even less likely to have an adverse response that's acute in nature. So why on earth would we not want them to develop an immune response to this disease itself? It's far better for you than the vaccination, lasts longer, has a better systemic response than any of the alternatives. So stuff like this is just, it's not only is it not producing the outcome that the administration says it wants, it's producing a very counterproductive result.
Absolutely. Todd Furniss is the author of the 60% Solution, Rethinking Healthcare. Todd, last question is, if you had to prognosticate here, what happens? Do we get to a point where, is the White House and the administration going to override this whole thing and say, look, you're going to have to get the boosters and we're going to have a booster mandate, and if you want to fly on a plane, you need a booster and all that? Or is the science finally going to win out?
I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a great divide in the country based on politics until the Supreme Court rules on it and says this doesn't make any walking around sense and you don't have the constitutional right to do what you're doing. An example of this, an early sign, was the professor at George Mason who said, look, I don't need the vaccine because I already had the disease and there's no science to prove that I need the vaccine because I already had the disease. The Virginia court system ruled in the professor's favor.
That'd be, because that is the argument a lot of people make, and so much research, the Israeli study backs that up, that if you've had the virus, you have the antibodies, you have the antigens, that is probably better than having the actual vaccine. Yet I've heard in Europe that counts, right? But in America, for some reason, they don't allow that to be counted as someone who is now a part of this goal of getting toward herd immunity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense.
No.
Todd, listen, you're a great guest, man.
Good stuff,
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.